Aha, YouTubers! Welcome to Big Buddha is Watching. I'm Big Buddha, and today I'm going to be looking at one of my favourite comedy creations ever, Alan Partridge. Alan Partridge, I've been aware of since his inception in the early 90s. I think I first became sort of vaguely aware of him when he appeared on The Day to Day, the seminal fictional news program, or a satirical news program, because it wasn't a real news program, The Day to Day, which was hosted by Chris Morris, somebody I'll talk about more in later videos, I'm sure, because he's another genius along with Coogan. And Alan Partridge was on that as the just a minor character, but he was the sports presenter on that, and in that he was just very much a generic, one-dimensional sports broadcaster, sort of in the vein of whoever you'd see on Grandstand or Match of the Day at the time, but with kind of Terry Wogan hair and a regional accent. He sounded very different to how he sounds now. He sort of talked a bit like this at the time, and since then he's come down a lot. He's much more in close to Steve Coogan's actual voice. Both terrible impressions there, but that was how I first became aware of the character. But where he really sort of cemented in my imagination was in Knowing Me, Knowing You, which was a fictional chat show that was on the BBC. They made one series of it in 1994. Coogan at the time, he seemed to have a propensity for only making one series at a time of any project. You can see this with The Day to Day, which only had one series, Knowing Me, Knowing You, Dr. Terrible's House of Horrible, Coogan's Bluff, which was a show where he played different characters every week. So Knowing Me, Knowing You only had one series and a Christmas special, and the Christmas special is just an absolute work of genius. But let me go back a little bit. So the story of the characters started on Radio 4 in 1991 on the Hour, which is the radio version of The Day to Day, and that's where the character was created by Coogan and the producer Amanda Iannucci, who later went on to create The Thick of It and Veep and various other satirical comedy shows, and he was created out of necessity. Coogan was just a player on that program. He played various different roles, but the character came along just because they needed a sports presenter to do a mock-up of the sports presenting bits, and so that's where the character was born. And because Coogan was obviously far and away the most talented performer on that program, not to take anything away from the other performers on there, like I say, Chris Morris is a genius. You also had David Schneider, Rebecca Front, Doom McKeegan, and Patrick Marber, who were all major talents in their own right. Patrick Marber wrote heavily for the Partridge character in Knowing Me, Knowing You, and then would later go on to become a playwright of quite some renown. He wrote a play called Closer, which was adapted into a film by Mike Nichols, and starred Clive Owen and Julia Roberts. And he also wrote the screenplay for a film called Notes on a Scandal, which stars Judi Dench as a sinister headmistress and Kate Blanchett as one of the teachers who she ends up tormenting, really, and destroying the life of a really criminally overlooked drama. So but he got his start writing for the Partridge character with Knowing Me, Knowing You, and it's a real testament to how Coogan has endured over the years. He has surrounded himself with really talented types and really talented writers who have elevated his career, not just with Partridge, but in his other projects. You know, you have writing for Alan Partridge, you've had Armando Iannucci, of course, Patrick Marber, who would later go on to be an Oscar-nominated screenwriter, Peter Bainham, who now writes a lot of Hollywood comedy movies. He wrote Arthur with Russell Brand and the Hotel Transylvania movies. And recently he's found these other two writers, a couple of brothers called Rob Gibbons and Neil Gibbons. And so he's had a real pedigree of talent working with him over the years. And on other projects as well, you know, most famously Michael Winterbottom and Rob Brydon with The Trip and The Cock and Bull Story and 24 Hour Party People, which is another film I intend to review because that's one of the best films of the past 15 years, if you ask me. So the character launched on the Hour, and it's funny because on the Hour tonally it was a very different beast to all the other iterations of Partridge that came after that. From Knowing Me, Knowing You onwards, Partridge was very much set in a real world. It's almost a reality that happens in parallel to ours. But on the Hour and the Day to Day were absurdist, sort of Python-esque inspired humour. Though it was satire and a send-up of news programmes, the humour inherent in those programmes is absurdist humour. You get jokes of Alan's wife dying and him just casually passing this off as a bit of banter that he has with Chris Morris, and then the next episode you have a follow-up to that where Alan's wife has miraculously been resurrected from the grave, and Alan just having an off-the-cuff remark with that, where he really shone, I think, in the character on the Hour and in the Day to Day is they get Steve Coogan playing a sports presenter who really doesn't know much about sport. What they do is they'd sit him down in front of VT footage of real sporting events and just get him to comment on what was going on. But it was really funny because Coogan obviously didn't have any idea what was going on. So he'd just make up these really silly remarks and silly gags which related to the VT footage, and then you'd have him in the Day to Day. He'd go out and be on location at Cheltenham or whatever, and there's really funny sequences of him getting caught in the rain whilst there, and one scene he interviews a lady jockey as she's getting undressed. She takes her top off in front of him. She's got her back to the camera, and he just gets flustered while he's interviewing her. So they made 2 series of On the Hour, and then Alan gets his own spin-off series, Knowing Me, Knowing You, named after the ABBA song, because then they really started to introduce little traits like Alan's taste in music, and they thought ABBA wasn't really right for lampooning at the time, not like it is now, but there was something very funny about somebody being an ABBA fan. So Knowing Me, Knowing You became the title of his chat show, and you can imagine Alan thinking this was him being very, very clever. What's genius, what I love about Steve Coogan, who is somebody who I will religiously watch him in anything, especially if it's something that he's originated himself, is I think he's the Peter Sellers of our time. I know that's not an original comment, but it's very true. Peter Sellers and Steve Coogan transcend most other comedy character actors. Most comedy character actors tend to mind the comedy from finding the absurdity of a character and mining a character for laughs, by just portraying the absurdities on screen, little facial tics and catchphrases and pratfalls and what have you. Whereas what Sellers did and what Coogan does is they go beyond that. They're brave enough to look for the truth in a character, look for something that feels very genuine, like it could exist from the real world, and display that on screen. In Coogan's case, almost like an open wound. And I think that's when the characters they played really become something hysterically funny, because it's something that you recognise from the real world writ large, and suddenly realising how ridiculous the things we do in real life are, and openly admitting that on screen that these absurd things that Alan does, really the reason we find them funny and so cringeworthy a lot of the time is because we recognise something of ourselves in Alan, our worst instincts writ large. So where was I? Yes, the character moved to onto having his own chat show, and then both On the Hour and Knowing Me, Knowing You got their own TV iterations in 1994. I'll talk about Knowing Me, Knowing You in another video. I'm going to set aside another video for that for itself, because it was it's one of my favourite comedy series, and I'm also going to look at I'm Alan Partridge, the sitcom starring Alan that he did, because that's my favourite comedy series. And then I'm also going to do a fourth video on the film as well, because after all, this is a film review site. This is me going off page, really, doing TV comedy. But I do love TV comedy, especially British TV comedy from a certain era. So I am going to look into that in some depth in the future. So the character moved to TV, Knowing Me, Knowing You, and then, as I say, 2 series of I'm Alan Partridge, and then he starts making various other appearances, most notably in Comic Relief, and and he appeared on the Clive Anderson's Chats show, playing himself. Clive Anderson primarily interviewed real life guests, but on a couple of occasions he would interview people in character, most famously with Peter Cook, and I think I'm right in saying the only other time he did it was with Steve Coogan as Alan Partridge. But that's one of the great things about the character, is I think the reason he really hasn't got tiresome over the years and outstayed his welcome is because, like I say, he feels genuine, and also he exists in real time as well. The character, when he first appeared, he made a reference to being 37 years old, and he's kind of aged in real time. He's not aged the same way that Homer Simpson or Bart Simpson has, which is not at all. He's kept consistent with the real world, and he's also been quite stringent, Coogan, about sticking to the canon of the characters. So if you read Alan Partridge, We Need to Talk About Alan, which is Alan's supposed autobiography. Or even better, listen to the audiobook version narrated by Alan himself. Offhand jokes that he made in Knowing Me, Knowing You about being bullied at school by a kid called Steve McComb and called Smelly Alan Partridge were then incorporated as canon into Alan's timeline and cemented in the autobiography We Need to Talk About Alan. So you get a whole section on Steve McComb in that book. A very funny bit where he phones up Steve McComb. Oh, that gives it away. The passage is presented as him standing up to McComb after years of torment and telling him to watch it. But then the twist at the end, it transpires that the conversation is happening on the telephone, and it's about 5 years after they left school. If you listen to the Knowing Me, Knowing You DVD commentary, Armando Iannucci tells Patrick Marber at one point that he received a thesis from a graduate about Alan, and the thesis was all about what works great about Alan is he adheres to the Aristotelian principles of time, space, and unity, which I guess is what I just said about Alan existing in real time and in the real world, and the canon staying consistent. You know, they don't deviate at any point from it, except here and there. There is a comic release sketch in which Alan says that he's engaged to a woman called Tony, and then goes on a big tangent about how it's Tony with an I, not a Y. And as far as he knows, she hasn't had a sex change. But then Tony's never really mentioned again in any of the other literature. But I guess they thought as the sketch was probably not seen by that many that they could get away with it, but I always wonder what happens to Tony, because I had that taped on TV, so I've seen that sketch quite a few times. But other things have remained consistent, like him having an ex-wife called Carol, children called Fernando and Denise, who've also aged in real time, and then his relationships that he's had with Sonia, his Ukrainian girlfriend, and the woman who he works with at North Norfolk Digital, who he gets together with in the film and then subsequently breaks up with in Mid Morning Matters. So you got the character appearing consistently on TV throughout the 90s and the early noughties. Then there's a bit of a hiatus for about 8 years where Coogan went off and did other things and tried to have a Hollywood career, and well, we won't go into what happened there. But I think there was one appearance on Comic Relief in 2005, but apart from that, he was largely absent from our screens until 2010, when he decided to resurrect the character, but resurrect him in this revolutionary new format called YouTube. And what I really admire about what Coogan did there is he put out 12 15-minute videos, but did it with very little fanfare. He thought that if people wanted to see these things, he liked the idea that people would discover Alan's return, and so he did very little publicity. But I found out that Alan was coming back, and obviously being a major fan, I sought the things out, and I have to say they were brilliant. You know, it was a real eye opener. It's a lot of comedy does date, and characters do become tiresome over time. But where Alan has worked is he hasn't stuck to a single format. You know, if we were on I'm Alan Partridge Series 8 now, it would be very, very tiresome, and it would be the character going through the motions. But because he's constantly rejigged the format that he presents Alan in, from seeing his fake chat show and from seeing him on a fake news program, through to seeing him in an Eye of God sitcom, through to seeing him on what is supposed to be just a webcam in a radio studio. The idea is that Mid Morning Matters is made up entirely of Alan's radio program. So because he's rejigged the format, the character has remained fresh, and because he's now working with different writers, I think there is a much fresher take on the character every time he comes back. Also, as well as the Mid Morning Matters, on which can be seen on Sky now, Coogan's done a couple of fake documentaries, and that, I mean, if ever there was a character who would lend himself to the fake documentary format, then it's Alan Partridge. And there's one in particular, the most recent one they've done, called Scissored Isle, which is absolutely brilliant. Just really, really well written comedy, and it's gratifying to see that Coogan never phones it in with Alan. He obviously really cares about the integrity of the character, and so he really gives it his all. That you can see that they never just sit down and let Alan talk and hope for the best and hope for gold. Woe betide anyone that would do that. He really thinks about the situations and that he gets Alan into, and the really well-mined comedy situations. There's a particularly brilliant bit where he accidentally takes ecstasy and then has to interview the mayor the next morning, and they have to redub the interview because he's on a major come down. Very funny stuff. So I think that's all I'm going to say on the character for now. Other than I have loved the character for years and years. I remember at school overhearing a teacher talking about knowing me, knowing you, and saying, I love it because it's so dark. And I was like, yeah, you're right. It's dark, and that's why it's funny. And I'm attracted to the dark. I'm attracted to the psychologically upsetting nature of comedy, I guess, and that's why it's right up my street. So there you go. That's all my thoughts on Alan Partridge for the moment. But if you want to hear more, then join me on my next video, which will all be about knowing me, knowing you. So until then, this is me, Big Buddha, signing off, and I shall see you all out there in YouTube land.